Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I am your host, Steve, and we are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, including Scott Rank's History Unplugged podcast, along with James Early's podcast, Key Battles of American History, Richard Lim's This American's Presidents, and Josh Cohen's Eyewitness History podcast. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. I'd like to quickly mention, as usual, we are on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. There's 4 tiers: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. The biggest benefit to you is, beyond just supporting the show, which is huge and really, really appreciated, you are included on the History of the Papacy diptychs, which in traditional Christianity was the list of bishops in order of their prominence. So you want to join Patreon sooner than later so you can be higher on that list. Today, I would like to send out a very special thanks to our latest patron at the Constantinople level, John. Connecting with John has been an extra bonus and really special because through our conversations on Patreon, we discovered we're old family friends. We grew up within just a few blocks of each other in Buffalo, New York, and our fathers knew each other. His brother taught me how to ice skate. It's really cool what we can do on social media these days and through this wonderful medium of podcasting. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, and Sarah at the Alexandria level. Dappo, Paul, Justin, Lana, and John, all of whom are magnificent at Constantinople and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome, we have Peter the Great. Today, Dr. Carolyn McNamara of the University of Glasgow in Scotland brings us up close and personal to history through her personal experience in participating in an actual archaeological dig on the Isle of Lismore in Scotland. We discuss the importance of connecting the history of actual artifacts and texts to make a clearer understanding of history. Dr. McNamara also explains the benefits and drawbacks of reliance on texts and archaeology in the study of the past, and how we can use both of those items and other methodologies to get a clearer picture of what's going on. With that, here's the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Welcome back to another exciting episode in our series on Irish Christianity, and we are joined again by Dr. Carolyn McNamara of the University of Glasgow. And today's a little bit of, we're stepping out of the exact narrative of Irish Christianity, but we're going to focus in on one really specific and interesting aspect of the study of Christianity and this whole area of the world, and that's through the lens of archaeology. And Dr. McNamara was able to participate in an actual archaeological dig in Scotland, and that's what we're really going to discuss today. So some specifics about this particular site and some of the overview of the importance of archaeology and practically how archaeology is done. Dr. McNamara, how are you doing today?
I'm doing excellent. Had some recuperation time now from the dig, which was great fun. So I'm happy to be here to talk to you about it today.
Well, yeah, I'm definitely excited to learn more. Now, I guess the broadest question that we could ask is, what is archaeology?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So my first thoughts on that are that it's a method of examining the past and a kind of an approach and methodology that we can use to examine the past. And then in addition to that, it's a science. So it's something exciting, and you can put that meticulous scientific brain you have to archaeology as much as you can put that more free-form kind of historical brain towards that. And I like to just take a moment to talk about all the different kinds of hard sciences that we might think about and can add to archaeology. So there's Botany, you can do archaeological botany specialty where you look at the plants that are being dug up or that there's evidence that were around at the time. There's biology, whether you want to look at people or animals or the environment. Chemistry, zoology, which of course is going to be more about the animals. Computer science, you can bring that into archaeology. Forensics, climate or environment studies, geology or earth sciences, even astronomy and maritime studies. You can look at underwater archaeology or coastal archaeology. There's just so much that is encapsulated within archaeology itself that just, I think, makes it mind-boggling how much there is to dig into for it.
It's got to be really difficult to be an archaeologist because you really have to be an expert in the particular methodology of archaeology, which is a PhD in and of itself. Then you have to at least know something about the history to know what you're digging for. And they have to have all sorts of specialized knowledge of the equipment they need to use. And if they have to use a backhoe, or in underwater archaeology, the whole thing of not killing yourself deep sea diving.
Yeah, underwater archaeology, I think is just astonishing because you're right. At the very outset, before you even get to do anything archaeological, you have to be a trained, skillful scuba diver. And just the thought of having to then try to meticulously go through stratigraphy on the floor of a body of water, you're in this environment. It's not like you just put the dirt in a bucket and take it and dump it into a pile. Like, there's just so much to dig into with that as a concept that I find it astonishing.
Now, we're doing a history podcast here and a history lecture series with you on the history of the Papacy podcast on Irish Christianity. What do we need to know archaeology for? Why is archaeology important for this?
Yeah, so this is another great question. And I'll start by pointing out that I'm not an archaeologist. Like, that's not my primary area of research, and I don't consider myself an archaeologist, though I work with archaeological material and material culture quite a bit in my own research. So I find it quite useful as a interdisciplinary researcher to look to archaeology as another avenue of finding information about the past. And I can then try to connect it to the textual evidence that I have, or if there's no textual evidence in some times, which does occur, and especially at the site of Lismore that we're going to talk about today, there are periods where there's really very little textual evidence or no textual evidence, and all we have is the archaeology to tell us more. So in more broad terms, if an early author writes about an item and then we find it in an archaeological dig and we can date that item to the time period when the author was writing about it, then that can help confirm that we can trust what the author said. So it can give us some evidence of reliability in our textual records. And as I said, when there's no textual record, it can help to fill some gaps, even though they're not the same kind of evidence. And I wouldn't call them a one-for-one exchange. They are really useful to be interdisciplinary in how you approach it. Archaeology can also give us a lot more detail about material culture or the things than we might get from just reading. How much detail will an author go into in describing a medieval shoe versus what we can learn by finding one?
What happens when the textual evidence conflicts with the archaeological evidence?
Yeah, this is a great question. And so the biggest question that comes up from that for me is, why does it conflict and how does it conflict? Because those questions themselves may lead us to a better understanding of the situation. If it's just one small piece of evidence, we might weigh that against the variety of textual accounts that survive. So if we have a lot of different people all talking about the same thing, and they're kind of agreeing with each other, and they're not all just copying the same original guy, like, we feel pretty confident that we can trust what they're saying. And then we find one small thing at only one archaeological site, we might go, well, the balance of that evidence, maybe it undercuts a little bit what the textual evidence says. Maybe we decide that it doesn't. Maybe it could be that one archaeological site as an anomaly or we've misunderstood something, but it definitely can lead us to reassess the information about an author, where that's known, their intent, their audience. Yet at the same time that it can be helpful in making things more believable, it can also bring up more questions for us. And, I kind of like when that happens, because then we go, all right, is there going to be something else out there that helps to clarify this muddy picture? And most of the time what we get is a fairly muddy picture that we're trying to make sense of.
And now a word from our sponsors. Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think it makes me think of, now you're an expert in your field and you have somebody who's an archaeologist, they're an expert in their field. And, you've laid out that there could be any number of experts along the line who are experts in medieval shoes or the medieval shoes worn in a monastery. And everybody, just naturally kind of lives in their own silos and their own communities in the academics. How do you kind of get together so that you can share this information to try and make a bigger picture out of these pieces that start coming out?
Yeah, that's a good question. And sometimes the answer is to get different specialists together. So you may have someone who is in charge of the dig as a whole, like at this dig at Lismore, we had Gaelic Archaeology and Claire Ellis, who's the leader of that company. She was in charge of the dig as a whole, but she brought in an osteoarchaeologist, so a specialty in human bones, because there was an expectation of finding, human bones on the site. That's what happens when you dig in a medieval graveyard, is you find human bones on site. So yeah, she brought in a specialist for that. And as part of the report that will be generated from this dig, she'll have to give some of the background of the site. And, she's got enough knowledge to be able to do that, but it doesn't necessarily go into the same level or depth that, my research has gone into on that site, because her purpose is a little bit different than my purpose is in giving that history. She's just trying to provide some context and then talk about the items that were found or the structures that were found.
It's got to be a lot of fun, but it's also probably presents some challenges too of, really speaking the same language and finding what she's interested in and what that expert, and trying to get it to line up with your expertise to try and get something more out of it.
Yeah. And I think for myself, I've had the opportunity to study archaeology, especially in undergrad. And that's given me enough of an understanding to be able to work with evidence from archaeological digs and the reports that are generated from them, and know how to pull out the parts that are going to be useful to me and to interact with them, I'd say appropriately, I guess, and to be able to then use that information for my own interdisciplinary, and by interdisciplinary, I literally mean across disciplines, or bringing multiple disciplines together to be able to do a broader research.
We'll start talking about the archaeology project that you were in, but where do people do archaeology?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have this idea that there's only special places that one does archaeology, like maybe the pyramids in Egypt or, maybe at Stonehenge. But the truth is you can do archaeology, and people do archaeology anywhere and everywhere. There's a glacier archaeology program in Norway that I really love to follow called Secrets of the Ice. They've got a Facebook page, and I'm sure we can get that in the show notes to share. They find amazing things. We've already mentioned underwater archaeology. So that's looking at underwater cultural heritage, whether it's, civilizations or houses that have been immersed in water due to changing sea heights or due to creating dammed up rivers, or it can be shipwrecks. And there's, a website from the Sea Museum that's just about maritime archaeology that I find really interesting and gives a good breakdown of what that's like. So really, it's everywhere, and you can try to do archaeology everywhere. You may not necessarily find something everywhere, but people have lived all over the globe for a long, long time. So there's a possibility that you might find something almost anywhere. People have been in Antarctica for a while now. And so we're starting to leave evidence that maybe in 200 years we'll go do archaeological digs in Antarctica.
What kind of things are the archaeologists looking for when they start a dig?
Yeah, so there's a number of different things that archaeologists could look for. That includes structures. So that can be walls, that can be houses, floors. It can be, all different kinds of things like that. But it can also be just things, and that can include boats or tools or pottery, clothing, weapons, musical instruments. It can include just places. So whether it's just a hearth, someone built a fire to cook on while they had a campsite, that's going to leave some record of their presence there. We can find the charcoal and dig that up and know, okay, this is a thing. It could be a camp. If the Romans were on the march and they stopped somewhere for a short camp, they would build a camp, and we could find that. Villages or forts, all different kinds of places. We might find the people themselves, whether it's in, careful burials or whether it's in, not so careful burials. We look for food if we've got especially a midden, and by a midden, I mean garbage. So garbage can tell us a lot about people, and it can include lots of different kinds of things, including food, broken tools, worn clothing. It's a great place to look for the things that archaeologists hope to find. And, if we think about just the things that are in our own trash cans right at this moment, what could an archaeologist tell about us if that's something that they found?
So you could say in a lot of ways that what you can find in a garbage dump is at least as important, and maybe in some respects even more important, than finding a big hoard of gold and jewels of a king or a queen.
Yeah, I'd say that it's easily as important. As much fun it is to find a giant hoard of gold or a fancy burial with jewels and stuff in it. And yes, that absolutely tells us valuable things, especially about, art in the society or elite goods. Having that look at possibly really ordinary, everyday people in a midden when they're found at non-elite sites is a glimpse that we are not often going to get otherwise. Lower status people are going to be less likely to be buried with lots of fancy grave goods or grave goods that would survive a long time. And, things don't always survive well because of the soil content. Your bones will eventually dissolve and you'll become part of the soil. And so will whatever shoes you were wearing when you were buried. And even, items like iron will break down over time and can just be lost.
You recently were a volunteer at a specific archaeological site on the Isle of Lismore in Scotland. Can you maybe just tell us a little bit about the dig and where this is?
Yeah, absolutely. So where it is on the Isle of Lismore, which is in the Firth of Lorne in Argyll. So it's just a bit northwest of Glasgow, and there's a port city there, Oban, that people might be familiar with. You take the ferry from there to get over onto the island. And it's, one of the furthest west or furthest east islands in the Inner Hebrides. If you look at it, it's a great little island. It's not very wide, but it's fairly long, so you can get around it pretty easily. And the dig itself was run by the Lismore Gaelic Heritage Centre as kind of the central force. And then the archaeology lead was Claire Ellis and her company. So she's a professional archaeologist, and her company is Gaelic Archaeology.
If you look at the map, you can pull up the general area that Lismore is in, and I think if you just zoom in on it, like the default view that Google Maps gives you, you're like, oh, okay, I see where it is. How did but then you zoom out a little bit and it seems like a pretty key location. What was important in the past about this particular area? How did it maybe fit in the larger history of Scotland and Britain?
Yeah, so the island itself is at a really important geographical point for travel between the Western Islands and the Great Glen. So if you're traveling up this Great Glen, you'll go by Loch Ness. So Loch Ness is part of the Great Glen to get up towards the Moray Firth and Inverness and that kind of area. And, we're told in the life of St. Columba that Columba, when he went to Fortru to visit with the Pictish king there, King Brutha, that he went up this Great Glen. So we know that was a method of travel. And so even in earlier times, there's a lot of evidence of Iron Age settlement on the island as well. That's the kind of place that you would want to have control over, because if people are wanting to come back and forth and travel and probably trade, then you would want to have some control over access to those trade routes.
I've heard the word glen so many times, but I don't know specifically. Is that describing a flatland?
So a glen is kind of like a hollow. So it's going to be if you've got two hills, you've got the glen that's going to be between them. So that's going to be the easier to traverse part rather than climbing over a hill or climbing over a mountain. And they can get quite steep in Scotland.
And so where Lismore was facilitated by a relatively easy traveling route then.
Yeah, so the Great Glen is this series of lochs that go up towards Inverness as it's known today. That would have been a preferred method of travel, because water-based travel would have been far easier in this early period in comparison to land-based travel.
Maybe before we dig into why they're digging there, what is it like on Lismore today?
So Lismore today is far less peopled than it was in earlier times. We're told that it could have a population of hundreds of people in earlier times. I think, if I remember correctly, today it's more around about 200 people. So it's not a big community these days, but it's only an hour by boat to get into Oban from Agnus on the island, or there's an even shorter people ferry ride that goes between Port Appin and the north end of the island. So it's got one major road called Entraid. It's the street in Gaelic. And that'll take you almost to everywhere on the island. There are a couple other roads, but I love that it's just called the street.
It works. And now a word from our sponsors. It's so in a way that this isn't a place where you have to work around a major city, or you're digging in people's backyards or under factories or that sort of thing.
Right. It's still a fairly rural area. There's one cafe, there's one shop, which is also the post office. And where we were digging was on, I believe it's all church-owned lands. I know part of the site has the church manse where their preacher lives when he's on the island. So
now, why are people interested in digging this particular location?
Yeah, this particular location. And so we were digging at the church at Clachan, and it's of note because there's an early medieval monastery that we're told in the textual record was founded by Saint MacLeod, who was a cleric from Ireland, who would have founded his monastery there in the late 6th century. So he died in 592. And we've got, I think, 2 people after him as abbots in the textual record before it starts to get really muddy for us. So we've got this early monastery in this important geographical area, and MacLeod may have had a hand in the conversion process round about his area, But we know that it was an important site in part because of the quality of surviving carved stones. We've got some really intricate stuff that we found there, and the fact that it became the seat of the bishopric of Argyll for a while. So their current parish church is the kind of restructured, or they've rejigged it a bit to work as a parish church rather than as the cathedral that it previously had been. So that tells us that it was pretty important, in the 12th century when that happened, or 13th century when that happened.
At its, was that fairly much its peak? Was the 12th or 13th century?
So that's an excellent question. I think that's where we get into some of the messiness of the doing of history. So the carved stones that we have are generally dated to around the 8th century. And so that shows that there was a lot of money, power, influence that likely existed there at that time. And, it probably would have stayed powerful and important in its area into the 13th century when the bishopric was seated there. But there's not a lot of record talking about it. We don't have hardly any Pictish sources surviving for the textual record, and the sources that do survive tend to have followed, this burgeoning kingdom of Scotland that starts to really gel together around this time. So they're not really that interested in this bit of Argyll. So we know that there was importance to it, but we can't always get at the evidence to help us understand why.
This is kind of interesting. Now, textually, what do we know about the culture of this monastery in this area throughout this time period? Because a lot changes in 500-600 years. What kind of culture was it originally? Language and that sort of thing. And how did that evolve based on what you know from the written record?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the answer is there's very little we can be absolutely certain of. So we're told in, whether it's the annals or the martyrologies, a little bit of information about MacLeod. It seems pretty certain that he comes from Ireland and comes to Lismore in Scotland. And there may have been Gaelic culture there. There may have been Pictish culture there. There may have been a mixture of both. It's really hard to know for sure. And part of how you perceive it is probably going to be affected by your opinions on the origins of the Gaelic language in the west of Scotland, and specifically in Argyll, whether you believe the language developed there naturally as Old Irish was forming as a language, or if you think that it was brought in through a movement of people. Starting in the 6th century, we've got a annal entry that says Fergus Mór MacEirc went with the people of Dalriada to the west of Scotland and died there. So this idea that they settled there. But the problem with that is that it's not a contemporary record at that point. And so someone later on would have inserted this entry into the year for 500 AD. So it seems less likely that actually happened versus it having been a created story to maybe help explain somebody's kinship or position of power or something of that nature.
Was this area more isolated from some of the bigger changes that were happening south with like the Normans coming in and the Anglo-Saxons? Did it keep that Gaelic culture there more so? And how much was it influenced from other things that were going on not too far away?
So it's likely that they could have had some interaction with the Saxons, especially the Northumbrians who had come in around the 8th century. They took over what we think of today as Galloway and Whithorn. So they were definitely interacting with Dalriada, which is the Gaelic culture people in Argyll, and they would have interacted with the Picts, and they were intermarrying with each other and hiding the out of favor members of the noble families of each other. So there was interaction, And then, the next group that kind of comes in for them would be the Vikings. So when they start coming in, and 793 is the first Viking raid, I believe that's on Lindisfarne. And so they get over to Iona a few years after that. And Iona's just maybe a day's sail away from the south of Lismore. So they would have had interaction with the Vikings as well. But the degree to which that happened, is more difficult to say, again, because we have few textual records and there's not been a ton of archaeology on the site. And even trying to look at the Vikings in Argyll as a whole can be a somewhat tricky process. But since the name of the island itself survives as a Gaelic name, and it's connected to the name that were given in the early period, that does suggest a degree of continuity that they were able to maintain through the Viking period and into, the 12th and 13th centuries.
Now, with that bit of background and context, what are the type of things that they're actually finding in the dig here in Lismore?
Yeah, so they've just concluded their 3-week period, and I was only there for the first week, which I really loved. I wish I could have stayed for the whole time, but it wasn't meant to be. So things that they're finding include structures. I found a wall. I got to spend a few days digging out part of a wall. We found a wall that was certainly part of a house, and I think they're planning to do some more research on that to find out, if it really is a Bronze Age structure like they think it might be. So there's a floor that they've found associated with the wall of this house, and a cobbled surface that came up in another one of the trenches. There's 3 trenches that they had for this dig this time around. They found some pieces of carved stone. So 2 different pieces were found, which I'm personally very excited about because I did some work on the previously existing pieces of carved cross. So these 2 stones that they found are probably part of previous crosses that were destroyed. So there's that metalworking evidence, whether it's from slag, which is a resulting waste from the refining process of ore. They found at least 2 coins, I think a 13th and a 14th century coin each, if I recall correctly, and a shroud pin. So back before they would put people into a casket, they would just wrap you in a shroud and use the pin to kind of pin it closed. They found fragments of pottery, whether it's modern or medieval pottery. They found some tools. The big one is a few flint scrapers. And so that's from earlier people, making their tools, and lots of bones, animal bones, mostly sheep and horse. And then, of course, some human bones, because as I said, they were digging in what was a known early graveyard. And that was part of the goal, was to dig in this graveyard and get some more evidence to look at the early site